African drums. I'm Elsie and I'm glad that you joined me this evening. September is Education Month, a moment when the nation takes time to celebrate the advances in the education sector and to congratulate those who have worked tirelessly for these advances to be realized. Cuffy250 believes that it should also be a time for honest and sober reflection on the state of education in Guyana. After all, many of us would agree that education is essential to national development. That if we make education a priority, it allows for a broader window of opportunity for our people, particularly those at the bottom of the social order. On today's program, we lead by example and pick up our own challenge by engaging in reflections on the state of education in Guyana, then, now, and beyond. Our panelists are all educators. Coretta McDonald is a teacher and General Secretary of the Guyana Teachers Union. Vincent Alexander is an Education Administrator and a Cuffy250 member. Professor Ian Robertson is a retired university lecturer and Language Education Policy Specialist. Freddie Kissoon is a former university lecturer, political activist, and popular newspaper columnist. Gentlemen and ladies, welcome to African Drums.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, and I think it's so interesting that we have Mr. Alexander and Freddie Kissoon sitting right next to each other tonight. You would have remembered that last week Freddie complained that Mr. Alexander takes up all of his talking time on the program. So I'm sure that Mr. Alexander will be more than generous.
No, we have a compromise.
Okay.
I agree that he was leaving because I said he was very impressed. And I told him his presence is always required. And therefore I will give way most of the time to him.
Okay, great.
So I owe it to him to take some of my time.
Okay, good. And that's a good example for our viewers out there in society. Good job, Freddie. Okay, let's begin about talking about education and its correlation with national development. Who would like to begin?
Vincent.
Mr. Alexander.
It's quite an interesting question. And it's a question which I would refer to what the minister has said repeatedly. What he has said, if we don't make education right, we will not get anything. So that education really is responsible for human resource development. And human resources are critical, essential, critical element in the development process. And therefore, it is something that has to be with attention if you're serious about national development.
Thank you.
Well, I think I must preface my contribution by saying people out there who are looking at this program shouldn't expect from me any criticism of the new government's approach to education. I mean, you have to be reasonable. These people have been in power just 60 months and they came in and met a demoralized, semi-devastated education system. So one cannot put much blame on the present government, but we could enunciate things that we should see. I mean, the president himself, in the presence of Miss McDonald, I think it was a ceremony sponsored by the Guyana Teachers Union, admitted that there's a crisis in education. So we could take it from there, but one has to be very careful in knocking the present government for something that they've inherited. But as I said, you need a start, and I think in some areas the starts are faulty. I'll come to that.
Okay, thank you.
Just want to say that education is a vehicle that can move any nation, and unless we start fueling up that vehicle, putting all the parts in place, we're not going to get to where we want to be. And to get there, it means that we have to have partnership in every aspect, in every area. And so we're looking forward to having not only our teachers, not only the Guyana Teachers Union, not only the members of the education system or within the education system, but we're looking forward to having the general public, everyone in society on board, so that we can have this kind of change that we're so looking forward to having.
Thank you. Professor Robertson.
Well, I'm listening to my colleagues and wondering if there is ever a time when education is not in crisis, if there has ever been a time when education has not been in crisis. It seems to me almost par for the course that once you have issues that relate to a wide range of concepts, a wide range of ideas, persuasions, belief systems, ideologies, that you're going to have crisis. The critical issue is how one learns to manage this crisis, how one organizes to develop understandings of these crises, and then to how one works to resolve some of these crises and to manage them for the advantage of the greatest number of people.
Okay, thank you. Let's go back a bit in time and reflect on education as part of the decolonization process. As we move from being a colony to an independent nation, how pivotal was education to this process?
If you allow me just one moment to comment on the
Sure.
contribution. I don't agree that one could necessarily say that education is always in crisis. If you want to talk about Guyana, that identify in a very factual way, it's always been a crisis, and one could do that. But I would think that education, like most phenomena, has always had contradictions. I don't know if that's what Ian is referring to as crisis. It's always had weaknesses. But I think that a crisis is only identified when your contradictions are fundamental and when you seem not to be having your objective in focus. So yes, education has contradictions. We'll always have contradictions. We'll probably have more contradictions than anything else because the pivotal roles it plays, but I wouldn't agree it's naturally always in crisis. Now, to come to your question.
Great, but Professor Robertson, do you want to?
Yes, I would argue that in fact
Sure.
this crisis I'm referring to is precisely what Vincent was talking about. You have a number of competing interests, you have a number of competing concerns, you have a number of developmental issues that arise, and there's no nation that ever arrives at the point at which everything has been achieved in relation to education. So there's always a need to keep monitoring, evaluating, moving on, changing. That is what education is about. So I agree with him only insofar as I know he agrees with me.
I think we're on the
Yes.
same.
Which means that we should boil down by saying education is a process, and with this process comes changes, and we have to be so equipped to deal with the changes as they come from time to time.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Could you remind me of this?
Education
We were
as a
reflecting on
post-colonial
yes.
tool.
Yes, how education helped to move us along that process from becoming a colony to an independent nation.
Well, first of all, I think one has to accept that education is a part of the machinery of the colonial state to ensure that the status quo, the colonial status quo, was in place and remained in place. And that after independence, then we would have gone into a movement that sought to make education a tool of liberation rather than instrument of imposition of colonial rule. And there were a number of ways in which this was tackled in the Guyana situation. I think on one hand there was a look at the curriculum, the whole idea of how you make the curriculum more relevant to the society, addressing issues that the society is faced with and which should be resolved. I think also control of the education system itself became an issue, one which would still be debated today. But prior to independence, the system was essentially controlled by the church. And the system was used by the church, and we were in a sense Anglo-Saxon state, colonial Anglo-Saxon state, was used by the church to impose the will of the church on the society at large. I mean, one of the more glaring things that happened in the education system, for example, was that if you wanted to teach in an Anglican church, it had to be an Anglican, because the manager of the school is the priest of the parish. And so lots of people who were not Anglicans in search for a job were virtually forced to become Anglicans. Some of them did it by the change of names. So a lot of Indo-Guyanese changed their names so they could fit the bill when they're going to meet the priest in terms of presenting themselves as Anglicans. So one sees how the education system was used for a particular purpose, and the purpose was not necessarily in the interest of the Guyanese at large, and so we had to get to the point of change. Question of access as well in the education system, ensuring that people who, for example, in my days, and I suspect in all the days of all of us, probably except for Coretta, we couldn't go to high school unless we got a scholarship, and a small number of people who got or pay the fee. And I remember in my own instance, I delayed going to high school for 1 year simply because my mother couldn't afford the fee. I knocked around in primary school for an additional year.
I couldn't afford it, so I didn't go to high school.
We from the same area. And then when I got to fifth form, and my partial scholarship, which allowed me to go to high school, was exhausted, again I was faced with crisis. How do I go on to do my GCs? My mom couldn't afford the fifth form fee. So that education was not accessible. And so one of the things that had to happen after independence was to make education accessible. And one of the ways in which the state sought to make it accessible is to make it free. Now, the people criticize it and say you had poor quality education and all of that, but you had poor quantity education prior to that, because many people simply just couldn't go. So that was another element of the education system that required change. I think one must always recall what was Burnham's disposition to education. He, in fact, was the first education minister under the adult suffrage government in 1953, and his position was that we can't simply go and regurgitate. We have to be educated in a way that allows us to be critical thinkers, and that was another element that required change. I'm not quite sure on that particular aspect that we have in fact yet fitted the bill, that we have been able to change our system from one creating critical thinkers, from one which created people who regurgitated, to one which creates critical thinkers. That's still a challenge.
Okay, thank you. Now that you've exhausted both your time and Freddie's time. No, I'm kidding. Go ahead,
I'll
Freddie.
give you my time. No, I think it is natural that after colonialism, you restructure not only the curriculum, but also the canopy under which education was delivered. And I think I'm a critic of Forbes Burnham, but I think he was erudite and visionary enough to know what you needed to do was to establish a parallel educational system to that was inherited and that would not be easily demolished. And that's why you had a very phenomenal thing called the multilateral schools. And I think we are paying dearly for the demise of the multilateral school, because I think the multilateral school was the vehicle through which people like us, as well Vincent was talking, I did mention I couldn't afford to go to high school, and I remember when I got into UG I was so overjoyed, but you had to pay then. And I remember it was a guy who from the WPA who first paid my entrance fee to UG.
That was $100.
So, but in terms
It
of
was a lot of money back
right,
then.
it was a lot of money. But along the way, the colonial remnant still remained, and we're still living with some of it. I mean, if you look at UG, tertiary education, from the time of independence, we still went in the direction of Western style education, where the university emphasized the humanities and the social sciences. I mean, we're talking about after 50 years of independence, we live just right next door to the sea. I remember the late David Davies on the Starbucks News say there are very few countries where you drive in the capital and a couple of feet away is the ocean. But yet we never started a faculty in oceanography or coastal engineering or what have you. I mean, up to today, the first department that is filled is sociology. So you still have those remnants, but I would think we were fortunate in Guyana, both political parties and post-colonial leaders, to see education was a way out of liberation, and so we changed the structure and the system, and I think I am one of the person who benefited from that.
Like everything else, I would have benefited from that era, from what happened before then. And I am proud to say that because of those men who had vision then, I am a proud product of society, because I was offered free education. My parents had to struggle to go to school and to have higher learning. They had to pay, they had to move from one church, like Vincent said, to another church so as to facilitate them being a part of the schools and all of that. But in talking from my time, it's far different. We have not moved a whole lot, but we have moved from then. We've moved a great part to where we are now. We still need to develop our curriculums. We still need to change to suit us. Not only in Guyana but in the Caribbean, and with the help of all these gentlemen here, I think we are going to get there at some time. When, I'm not sure, but we are working towards getting there.
Three of the gentlemen here are getting on in age.
All
over 60.
But could I raise a number of issues which I think I want to start with something that Vincent said about critical thinking, because you see, there's an assumption that critical thinking is a special kind of thing that you acquire in a kind of academic sense. To my mind, critical thinking is acquired in life, in the school of life. If you look at the proverbs that people use in the Caribbean, they encapsulate a range of perspectives on the world, and they have a whole range of advice to give to us. And when I think about emancipatory education, I tend to think that the time has come for it to move into the area where it allows these various areas of critical thought, which have been pretty well established in the region, but which, because of the system in which we operate, which is so scribate, I would say, it's so closely linked to writing, that the oral side of our existence is very often lost, and so much of our understanding of our environment, ourselves, our people, our experiences never gets factored into our education system. I know that it's easy to look at the formal kinds of things. I was one of 3 people from Leg 1 who got government county scholarship in 1956. And I have to say that one of the other 2 was Bibi Safora Sadiq. We belonged to that elite group of 3 people from an island of how many thousand in primary school who could manage to get to secondary school free. So there's been a big change in that sense. But the other changes that I think are required to really take us beyond the period have not yet really begun to kick in the way which I think they ought to.
Okay.
I think we've been taken to a wider end in terms of what is education. I think in our initial comments, I think we were in a sense talking about the formal education.
But the formal education system.
But we have to accept that in terms of education, there are 3 aspects. And there is the formal, there is the informal, and there is the non-formal. And that all three of them, if they work cohesively, can be beneficial. One of the problems I think we have, and I think in the sense it was implied, is that if you have the informal moving in a particular direction, the formal in another direction, then you don't get the best product because of the rift and the pulling between the different directions. And so indeed, I think in the formal system, we have not done enough to facilitate critical thinking, which naturally takes place in the informal system. And for example, I don't think we emphasize so much the normative approach to education rather than the perceptive approach to education. And I always like, in the case of Guyana, to refer the School of Nations, which I think is a unique school because they do not embrace that formal, that normative approach, the way in which other schools embrace a normative approach. And so the children tend to have a kind of a wider horizon. They tend to be more inquisitive. They tend to be more involved in inquiry and discovering, rather than being restricted to learning by rote what is given to them. And so there is a lot to be done in the formal system that could embrace the informal system, which has lessons that could be learned by the formal system.
Of course, one can always argue as to who should take the lead in this, which side should take the lead. I mean, the formal system embracing seems a little bit, to my mind, a little bit patronizing, if you'll pardon the term, in that I accept the formal system exists, I accept it has to exist. But I also believe that it has to be conscious of what else is around, and it must take the lead. It must be humble enough to take the lead where that lead is available in other areas of the society. That is more where my head would be.
You see, the problem I have is that it is taking the lead, but in which direction?
Okay, so several of you would have mentioned free education. I know, Coretta, you said that you were privileged enough to have free education. That is not the case anymore. We have to pay for our university education. So I want you to make the comparison for me of free education versus paid education, the pros and the cons. Well, everyone, not just...
There are pros and cons. There are pros and cons. I want to use the case of an exchange I've had with the law faculty in Barbados. Up to recently, Barbados provided free education at the university level for all of its citizens. And the Guyana, by then, students were paid. And there was the argument by the Barbadians that the students were rather lackadaisical. They took it for granted because the education was free, and that the Guyanese students who were paid seemed to be far more serious about the education, because for them they had to find the buck to get it. So that you do have advantages and disadvantages, but I would think that the question really should not really be just about free or paid education. It should be about access. So that even in a system where one has to pay, and which lends value to what you're getting, there should be mechanisms to ensure that people have access through various mechanisms, whether it's the loan schemes or things like that. And secondly, it's my own view that lots of people talk about the public sector being run like a business, and one gets the impression that they're talking about profit. I am of the fervent view that the public sector must be service-oriented, but that it must be business-like. In other words, it must be efficient and effective in what it does, but it doesn't have to aim at the profit motive. And therefore, even as we talk about education, which is not necessarily free, it must not be driven by the profit motive. It must be driven by the service motive, with mechanisms for cost recovery and things like those.
Okay, thanks.
I have an ideological and contextual position on paid and free education. Ideologically, I believe the state has an intrinsic duty to provide certain services. Contextually, we would never in 100 years reach the level of Germany, and Germany provides free education, university education. The introduction of paid education, I do not think was motivated by the leaders in government looking at the treasury. I think it was part of an imposed economic model after in the 80s, particularly coming on to the latter stage of Mr. Hoyt's rule, in which multilateral economic agencies internationally said, if we go to help you restructure your economy, there has to be a decreased role for the state. And the state, whatever service they provide, they must attach a monetary dimension to it. That's how we start paying for water, etc. But ideologically, given our state of economy, given the nature of our economy, I would reject paid education at the tertiary level.
Okay, thank you.
Like everything else, everything that we do in life, every choice we make, every decision we make, every aspect of life that we enter into, it has its advantages and disadvantages. For me personally, education should be free. I'm saying that to say this. When we offer free education, then there's so much more that we can get out of our people. And I would want to go back to the days of the national service. I know that that's a big, that's big taboo business. But if we go back to the days of national service, it brought about a sense of belonging. It brought about the sense which says, I am a part of this. I am here. This country belongs to me or belongs to us. And so we find for paid education, I have the money, so I go. My family, they can afford it, so we send our children, and you find our children, they just go off there, and it's what we're having now is a reflection of what is happening at university, where you can afford to pay and you go there, you graduate, and very often we find persons just coming out of the university with a degree and not what we expect them to have. Whereas if education were free, then the spectrum would be wider, much more persons would be able to attend university, and the joy of being there and having to do A and B and C and D as part of the completion of your program would be much more beneficial to us. And then we would have many more lecturers at university giving of their best. And so when we have the lecturers giving of their best, and the students that you're putting out will be students, A-class students, if we want to put that in uplifted commas. And these are the students who will go out into the world of work and want to give of their best. But when we have paid education, like I know some persons would want to say, well, if you don't pay for it, you don't value it. But for me, when you give and it's open, then you'll have many more persons being a part of it. Many more persons want to contribute to making things happen and making things better.
Thank you.
I have some personal contradictions on this issue. I happen to have worked in the university system for 3 times as long as I worked in the University of Guyana system. And in Trinidad, where there, up until a few months ago, there was a lot of money floating around and people could do all kinds of things they can't now. And one of the things that we experienced was that we had what we call GATE, which was really government assistance for tertiary education. And in that system, tuition fees are virtually free. I don't think students really paid anything once they stayed in the program again. Sometimes they didn't even do that. My own view is that when you put that burden on the farmer, the person who himself didn't have in the first instance access and who should have had, that there's a responsibility that the student should have and that the students should be educated into that responsibility. In other words, I keep going at the broader context of education here, Vincent, because you see, if the student understands the implication of somebody paying a tuition fee and sees the responsibility, if it's national service, it's national service. I know Freddie's not going to like the national service one, given what I know of his experience.
Has a revisionist view, man. Has a revisionist view.
I could speak for myself, please.
Is you bring him back, you know?
But what I'm saying is that one needs to ensure that as we enter into this sense of fair play, we don't allow at the same time it to become freeness to do what you like. There are always implications, there are always responsibilities to a wide range of publics, and we have to bear those things in mind. And it is the responsibility, in my view, of those who support non-fee paying tertiary level any education, to ensure that students understand what that means. Because I don't think, in the case of Trinidad, that they did. Our students, well, don't let me go into that. But I have to say that I've seen so much wastage in the system. And poor people that are carrying it. Can't be right.
A comment on all three of my comments. I agree with Freddie that the introduction of fee paying, the reintroduction, was driven by the donations. I don't think the government itself would have done that, and I think that is reflected in the lax way in which they sought to recoup the loans, and how they insisted every year that the monies allocated to the loan agency were in fact a subvention to the university. It's a mindset. They really didn't want to do it, but they found a way to do it and still not to do it. I think Coretta has developed an ideal model of what it should be. I don't think it's really applicable in this real world we live in. I think that Ian has put his fingers on the problem. You know, our countries in this era of freedom of movement and all of that make significant contributions to the developed world by virtue of the manpower, human resource, that leave our shores after being trained and going overseas. They don't have to pay a dime to train these people, and they contribute to those economies. And so I think we've got to find some balance between what you get in terms of education and what you get back to the society. You've got to find the balance. You just can't be throwing money down the black hole. So that whilst free education is good, I think we have to find some mechanism to allow, so when people are given free education, particularly at the tertiary level, for them to give back to that society which they got the education from. It always reminds me of a story told to me about Nyerere in Tanzania. The University of Dar es Salaam, free education, and the students leaving the University of Dar es Salaam to go all the way to a village where Nyerere was working, as he did annually in his farm, to protest some condition in the university. And Nyerere said to them, he said two things. He said, do you see where I am? I'm in my village farming. He says, do you know who pays for your education? All of these peasants here who have not had free education and who are not yet benefiting from your free education. So please stop this thing about asking for more and consider taking your education seriously and how you can contribute back to the society. And they place their tails between their legs and went back to Dar es Salaam and did the work they had to do. We have to be able to find a way for the people who benefit from free education to give back. There are literally thousands of Guyanese who benefited from scholarships and went overseas and felt that they had, because of some problem with Bornholm, that they had the right not to come back. And the sufferers is not Bornholm. The sufferers will be the Guyanese people on whose backs they climbed to get the free education, and then didn't have the moral instinct to even come and give back to society for a short period of time.
My only thing with that is, of course, that I'm saying that the system, the education system, has a responsibility to ensure that they know that.
Well, I agree with you, because the education system, the formal education system, in my mind, should not primarily be certifying people. It should be a system that seeks to impact personal development. And if it impacts personal development, then those students coming out of the system can have the kind of conscience and commitment which the system would have imbued in them to give back to society. So I agree with you.
Which means that we have got to start from the nursery school, so that we can develop that attitude of love, loyalty, patriotism, so that one, having passed through nursery school, entering into primary school, you have that sense of belonging, that here, this is my country and I have to do something. I have to make my contribution in order to help those who are coming behind me. So that when I would have left primary school and entered secondary school and moved from secondary school into tertiary education, it's already a part of me. So there is nobody else who must be saying to me, hey, when you finish university, don't skip the country, you gotta give back to Guyana. We should start, which means that we have to start looking very, very quickly at changing our curriculum in school. And when we do that, and it brings me to the point of, I remember when I was at school, we sang those patriotic songs. I'm not sure how many of us do that now, but these are the things that we have to bring back into our school system if we want to have that sense of belonging, if we want to be educated, if education is going to teach us to have that sense of loyalty, it has to start from somewhere. And the place to start it is in our nursery schools.
I agree with Coretta 100%. I really feel that the model we need for the education system is a system where the school is a reflection of what you want society to be. In terms of governance, in terms of environment, in terms of curriculum. That school must produce a person not merely based on what happens in the classroom, but based on the overall involvement. Our school should become complete learning communities. From the moment you step into the yard, the compound, or whatever you call it, it should be a learning process. Everything that the child does, how he treats his environment, how he treats his colleagues, how he treats the teachers, how the teachers treat the children, it should really be a model of what you want in your society, so that you leave that school and go into the wider society, taking certain values that then impact the way the society itself evolves.
You see, and what you really need, what you're really talking about, is a proper sense of self. A proper sense of self. Who am I in this context? To what body do I belong? What does it mean to be me? And the system has got to teach us that. Now, I noticed Freddie touched on the history and the thing. I happen to come out of the humanities and I have to defend them every time I hear people getting antsy about them, because that is where you learn that sense of self and who you are and how you relate to other things. And a proper sense of self is really fundamental to a proper education and to nation building. People will tell you all kinds of nonsense and you just buy into it if you don't understand who you are.
Okay.
The Freddie problem is easily solved. The emphasis now seems to be STEM, but I think really the emphasis should be STEAM, so that to that STEM you add the arts, so we have that completeness.
Okay.
Which means that we've got to go back a little too to the habit of consultation.
I hope you're not giving him my time.
We have to go back to the days when we had wider consultation, which would be able to bring the entire society on board. You see, it's one thing to teach the children in school, but what happens when the children go home? What is happening to the parent? And so we have to make this school a place where parents can feel comfortable visiting from time to time, where parents can be comfortable asking questions, seeking clarity on issues that they're not familiar with. Schools very often, I can speak about schools, and in particularly the primary and nursery schools. We have the situation where you have children at school, and you only see the parent when the child comes to school for the first day, and maybe when the child is going to be leaving at graduation time, closing exercise, then you see the parent again. Or maybe if a teacher put 2 lashes on the child, then you see the parent coming into school. But in order to change the entire education of people around, we have got to make our communities friendly, where we've got to go back to the days of having little talk shops in the streets, where we can, very often I would say to teachers and to educators, the parents who you would want to see, you will never ever meet them at the PTA meetings. You've got to go into the communities if you want to meet them, and there is where you'll meet them. And we talked about formal and informal education, and that's where formal education comes in, where some parents, I can't speak the Queen's language, so I wouldn't want to come to the PTA meeting to stand up and make my suggestion. But if you meet me on the streets, Freddie, we can talk about it there as man and woman in the streets, and we talk our street talks. So it means that we have got to really look again at our education system and the policies that we want to have, and the curriculum to make it wider, as Vincent said, so that we can create an all-rounded pupil or student or individual. We should not be only focused on all these exams. We recognize that our system now is really exams oriented. It shouldn't be that way. We should be able to create this individual who can think outside of the box.
There is something there that forces me to say what I'm going to say now. I probably would not have said normally. I went to primary school at Legon, and I surprised some people about 2 weeks ago in Trinidad by saying, I can make a basket. I know how to go and get mukru. I know how to cut mukru, how to clean it, how to let it coil and whatever you have to do, and how to begin to make a basket at least. And you can make a basket? Yes, I can. Well, I can't make a basket, but I'm sure I know what the processes are and how to go about it. I'm saying this to say that the people who taught us those skills weren't our classroom teachers. There were people in the society who had those skills. And that is the level of if you say go back, I can deal with that. But if you say go back to, I'm a QC boy. If they say go back necessarily to that kind of structure, it did me good, but I'm not so sure it did the entire country as much good as it should have. All right? So what I am saying is that once you start dealing with the broader group, you really need to begin to get down to those other competencies in the society, to recognize them and to enfranchise them within the education system.
Okay, let's zoom in a bit on education and policy. I know that Professor Robertson, you are a language education policy specialist. Well, first, I want you to...
I don't know what that means, incidentally, but go ahead.
You know that I'm going to ask
you. Give him a designation that he does
well,
know.
when I was supplied with your bio, that is what I got. So I want you to tell our audience what is language education policy and how that affects education.
Okay, let me start off by saying that when I was teaching in secondary school here in Guyana, I discovered that I was not as useful to my students as I thought a teacher of English needed to be. So I went ahead and decided that I'd get some training. It allowed me to develop a whole new perspective on the nature of language, on the nature of education, on the nature of the practices that we had, and the nature of practices that might be desirable and some that we haven't yet even considered. And I've been in teacher training for a considerable period of time, formally and informally. And in that period of my life, I ended up with some responsibilities. One of them had to do with textbook creation, for instance. And one of the things that struck me was that there was no way we used to manage transitions from primary to secondary in Trinidad at the time. You go to primary school and the next month you're in secondary school and nobody recognizes how traumatic a change it is, you know. So it became important to me to look at the system and begin to determine what are the kinds of policy objectives that one needed. Language was central for two reasons. It's my discipline, okay? I'm a linguist by training. And secondly, it was important because so much of Caribbean language is misunderstood and misplaced and frankly ill-treated within the education system. And I think that the issue of policy leads us to the point where we can identify some clear guidelines and principles based on information and knowledge which we have to help action based on whatever underlying philosophy we have. So it's a kind of a complex answer to your question, but you asked me a complex question.
Okay. Language policy in Guyana. Guyana is a plural society. So do you think that language policy will be useful within our education system, and how do we go about creating one?
But you must have a language policy within the system. I mean, it's not a question of whether it is useful. It has to be there. You can't simply decide that, oh well, it will happen, because it will not happen. It has not happened over time. And a significant proportion, let me just say, maybe large and maybe both significant and maybe both significant and large proportion of our population, it's not only in Guyana but throughout the Caribbean, has been disenfranchised in a number of different ways. I was talking to some of my relatives recently and saying, can you imagine what it is like for Creole-speaking Guyanese going to be treated by a Spanish-speaking Cuban doctor? Can you imagine? That is not part of our education consciousness. The parallel in St. Lucia, a patois speaking in St. Lucia, going to court where the magistrate is Bajan, Guyanese, Jamaican, doesn't speak patois. These are the areas that create all kinds of issues in relation to language policy. So I'm saying that there are critical areas that we have not addressed, and because we have been trained and have bought into, and it is a useful thing to have control of English. Let me not say, and I certainly would hope that nobody would say Robertson came on this program and was telling people you mustn't learn English, because that is not what I'm saying. But I am saying that we have a large number of indigenous groups who have little or no control of English, who have pretty sophisticated understandings of nature. I always remember a Christmas card which President Hoyt sent around many years ago before I left here, saying, there's a Makushi proverb, I think it's Makushi, I'm not sure, it says, the sky is the roof of the world, the trees are the pillars that prop the roof. If you cut the trees, the roof will fall. That must be dating back thousands of years, long before we started talking about ozone layer and all the rest of it. But there's an understanding there.
The area that I find that is absolutely horrible when he talked about the Cuban doctor is in the judicial system, in the court system. Sometimes these people are genuinely intimidated when you ask them to explain. Their best route is to cop out and say guilty, because they just don't feel lacking standard English, not armed with the finer trappings of standard English. They feel intimidated by saying, but your worship, you know, I didn't do the thing, you know. He come up to me first and he hit me. They don't want to say that. They just feel they don't know the consequences, and they're just intimidated, and they say, how do you plead? Guilty or not guilty? Guilty. And the consequences for them are terrible. In the case of the Cuban doctor, because of the doctor training, he may be sympathetic. Or when you have a brutal magistrate, there's no sympathy there.
Well, I don't know how sympathetic he could be if he doesn't understand what is wrong with you.
What is wrong with you?
Couldn't there be a slightly different perspective on this? Ian made the point that don't say I was against the teaching of English. And in society, there may be a need in a particular country for a common language of communication. Not to the detriment of people having their own communal languages. And therefore, what may be necessary is a recognition that people have their own indigenous communal language, and that in an effort to create an environment where they can communicate in a common language, that the English or the French or the Spanish
Or the
should really be
Portuguese.
taught the way in which a foreign language is taught, so that the person in a sense comes to that very conscious that this is my language that I speak and this is what I'm going to speak now, because this is the medium of the monolithic medium of communication or the national medium of communication. And so through that mechanism you respect the local indigenous communal language, but you at the same time you facilitate the learning of a medium that can be used by all for the national purpose. I am just
My only
trying.
thing there is that I will make a distinction always, and this, I guess I'm just being nitpicking here at an English, between foreign, second language, second dialect, other languages. Because you see, in a very real sense, English is not foreign. It is there in your face, and it exerts a certain kind of pressure, which French doesn't. French is foreign. Okay, so there's that kind of issue that arises, and just arriving at a proper kind of understanding.
But I think the issue here is a recognition that this person has a language, right? That is almost natural to the person, and the equal recognition that in the society there is a medium of communication which is not necessarily the language that the person has, and to treat that medium in such a way that the person is able to learn that medium, consciously learn that medium, knowing that this is a medium I'll use for communication at this level, but not to learn it as a replacement for the indigenous or local or language. So the person in fact becomes multilingual.
I wonder if I could come in here and confront Vincent. He said he was tired, but you don't look like he's tired.
You brought this on all of us.
But I'm watching at the time which is facing us, and there's
Yes.
something I wanted to get in. So I'm just going to get in it and let Vincent expand on it. And I am pretty depressed with the pattern over the years where 1%, 74,000, 47 people could do the SBA, the Standard 6 assessment, what you call common entrance. And every year, these people come from Region 4, and the more urbanized or the more quote-unquote modern section of Region 4. What happened to the other 9 regions? And that, I think, has to be a priority for education. I know Vincent is the advisor on tertiary. UG isn't doing good. There's something in UG I wanted to bring up, but but let me stop there. I saying this has to stop. This is a class thing, man.
I agree with Freddie. I don't think it's merely a class thing in the case of Guyana. We've got some problems that we have to deal with. In the school system outside of Georgetown and more so in the hinterland, we do have a serious problem of the availability of teachers.
Yeah.
We have a problem of the kind of infrastructure in place to facilitate teachers. We have a problem with the salaries,
And the resources.
and given the difference in the cost of living in the hinterland. So to me it's not just a class thing. We do have some geographic problems, the urban versus the rural, in a very with a number of dimensions. I think we've recognized those problems. The issue now is how do we overcome the problems. We have to do more building of accommodation in the hinterland. We've got to give more incentives. For example, this year, we had over 1,700 applicants to serial potters, with only 641 places available. So you then had to say, how do you determine who you would take in? And one of the things we said was that we'll give priority to teachers, applicants who are coming from rural areas, hinterland, and were prepared to return to where they came from. So you start to build up a cadre of teachers who are comfortable in the local environment, and so you start to get some assurance that you will have the number of teachers that you require. So Freddie, it's a real problem. I don't think it merely is a class problem. It's a problem to deal with economic circumstances and a number of other factors, which has been recognized and which has got to be dealt with. I don't think we've gotten the full solution, but the problem has been recognized.
And just to say, Freddie, that this year, last year, and the year before, we have seen some changes. Yes, you're going to have the majority coming from Region 4, Georgetown, but we've seen the outlying regions competing, real competition with Georgetown and Region 4. And so we would have had students attending, gaining places at Queen's College, and bishops coming from Regions 9, Region 8. Just right behind our back door here, Kokwani, we would have seen students topping their regions and making places at Queen's College and so on. So, like Vincent said, we have all these issues to deal with, and like what happened this year at the Sarah Potter College of Education, where we had to make a decision in terms of the teachers who are going to be at Sarah Potter College. This in itself will help us to be able to better mold the children, to be better able to facilitate the children and equip them with the kinds of skills they need. So when they sit at their grade 6 assessment exams, they'll be able to perform just the same way as children in Georgetown and Region 4 on a wider scale.
Okay. Well, we're just about out of time. So I want us to end on a good, positive note. So I'm going to give each person about a minute to tell the audience rather, about an innovative technique that can be used to make our education system better. And Professor Robertson, I've had a special request to ask you about using Calypso in teaching.
So you want to start with me?
Yes,
and you want
please.
to respond to that?
Yes, please.
Okay, that's the only thing I'm allowed to speak about.
No, you can answer mine. And
You
then
want my
yours.
minute? You want my minute?
No, I
Freddie's giving everybody his minute.
believe.
I'm Vincent is tired, so you have Vincent's
Treat.
minute.
I believe in the issue of as you will have heard me say, of community involvement and informing people's understandings and the street of the school of life. And I think that there are so many oral traditions which inform our being, which speak to our presence, which tell us who we are, where we have been, where we've come from, where we go. And there's some of these things tie in so neatly with the education system, with things we do in education. My favorite one is a calypso called Woman Bacchanal, in which you have two people. It's a calypso by Duke. Whatever else it might be, a little risky, not even risky, but not your ideal kind of family room chatter. But in that calypso, you have excellent examples of character sketching. This lady tells us, it's you who say, right? You better you leave and go, don't let me talk everything I know, right? Bailiff and take back my TV set. So there's innuendo, there's suggestion, there is character building, and we cannot get our students to write a proper character sketch, and they pass through the primary and secondary school, and it's right there in front of them every day. You know, I mean, okay, I've grown up, I've spent the last 30 years or so in Trinidad, more than that. And therefore Calypso is all very familiar to me. We used to run a program on Songs of Freedom on the radio here in Guyana some years ago. And Calypso is a very, very, very rich store of knowledge of information and of things that can be used throughout the education system. I also think other things are possible, like flying kites. We fly in kites, but we never look at the mathematics and physics of kites.
That's true. All right, thank you, Professor Robertson.
Vincent has my minute. Unless
I thought you were coming down.
Yes, I am coming down.
Yes.
All right. There are so many ways that we can look at improving what we do. The very thought of I always use that one, team teaching, twinning of classes, twinning of schools. It helps a lot. And let me give you my experience. I taught at East Penitence Primary School right in the back here. And like everything else, quite a lot of persons, because it's located in South Georgetown and East Penitence, or whatever it is, persons thought nothing good could come from East Penitence, in a few years ago. And one of the things I did when I was when I was in the grade 6 class is that I worked with Wilfred Success from West Rumvelt Primary School. And so there were days when Wilfred would come over to East Penitence and he would teach the grade 6 classes. I would go to West Rumvelt and we have this kind of exchange. We have our students, some of our students in classes at West Rumvelt, some of our students from West Rumvelt in classes at East Penitence. And I found that that kind of twinning, it worked well for our students. It built their self-esteem, and so they were able to compete with Wilfred. Of course, Wilfred was very serious, and they were able to relate to him. They were able to ask questions that they would, on a normal scale or a normal level, they would be afraid to ask. They were so open because he was able to bring out that in them to say, look, not because you're at East Penitence Primary, you can do extremely well. You can make Queen's College. You can make Roses. Now that we are into the days of technology, it's another way of making teaching and learning what we want it to be. We have a far way to go in getting there, but I think if we start at some point, we'll eventually get there, where we use technology a lot to bring out what we want to have happen. And I can use the experience of my own son. There are lots of things that sometimes I don't understand when my phone start giving me issues, and some things that I can't get it, and my son would come and say, well, girl, you only had to do this, or you only had to do that. And that is because he's exposed to technology, and our children now, they know all the ways of getting this done and that done, and being able to download this and delete this and clear the phone and so on. So we need to expose our children to every aspect, whether how little it is, so that we will be able to make teaching and learning better and much more comfortable in our society.
Thank you. Freddie, have your minute.
Briefly, I just wanted to reply to that, is that this girl or boy who did so well in Kokoni and make Queen's College, where are they going to live? Suppose there's no relative in Georgetown. And so my point is, I would like to see the duplication and replication of the quality we offer Region 4 and Georgetown students. I'd like to see that to the rural people, really. That's my wish for Guyana.
Thank you. A minute.
I agree.
No, a minute and a half. I gave you. I wasn't. I didn't
You
take
saved some of your minute for
I agree with what Freddie just said. Ideally, we should try to equalize the system. But it's been a challenge not only to Guyana, but the world of equalizing the education system. My last contribution is, I think that we have to pay more attention to integration, infusion in our teaching. Every 2 mornings, somebody get and want to add a subject to the curriculum. And I don't know how many subjects are going to have it. But I feel a lot of this stuff they want to add could be integrated in the subjects currently being taught. We need to pay more attention to integration and infusion in the present subjects, and that way it's more applied knowledge being taught than this theoretical and abstract teaching. it will require teacher preparation because it's a special skill if you could do integration. In English, you could integrate almost everything. And in many other subjects, you can do integration.
Science,
And in
social
that way,
studies.
you can in fact broaden the spectrum without increasing the number of subjects.
Okay. Thank you. And with that, we are out of time. We're about 5 minutes over time. So thank you all for being on African Drums.
Thank you for having us.
You're welcome. Viewers, thank you for staying with us. This has been African Drums, the television organ of the Cuffy250 Committee, an organization dedicated to the empowerment of the African Guyanese community through education and the encouragement of self-activity. Please remember to like our Facebook page, it's Cuffy250. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel, also Cuffy250. Send us an email, cuffy250gy@gmail.com, and please donate to the cause. I'm Elsie Harry. Please join me next time.